Welcome back to Grandma's Bedtime Stories series. And we are reading The Hardy Boys, The Disappearing Dog. And remember, there was a new boy that came to school. He was a magician. And then somebody's dog disappeared and then reappeared. And the Hardy Boys are looking for how, what, why, when, and where. And we're on chapter 7 called Chased. Just as Frank and Joe stepped off the O'Malley's front porch to head back home, they heard, "Bruno, stop, stop." Frank looked down the street and saw a huge brown dog pulling an elderly man holding a leash. They were both headed straight for the boys. "I think that poor man needs our help, Joe," Frank said. Right before the man and the dog got to them, though, the man yelled, "Do you boys have some of those new liver treats in your pockets? They're the only things that make Bruno go crazy like this." "Yes, we do," Frank shouted. "Do you want Bruno to have them?" No, Bruno loves them, but they make him sick," the man shouted. Run, please don't let him get them from you." Frank and Joe took off running, but the man and Bruno were right behind them. Up ahead, Joe saw a young girl who had a large black dog on a leash. All of a sudden, the dog started barking frantically and began pulling the young girl toward Frank and Joe. "What else is in these dumb treats besides liver?" Joe said. "I've never seen dogs go insane before." "Me neither," Frank agreed, "but we'd better change direction fast." They ran across the street, cut through a front yard, and jumped a low fence that bordered an alley. But they could still hear the frantic wailing of the dogs rushing to get the liver treats. The dogs were getting closer and closer. "I don't think we can make it home before they attack us," Frank said. He looked around, trying to get his bearings. "Hey, Chet and Iola live on the other side of the street. Come on." Frank and Joe ran down the alley. Just as they reached the next street, they saw the two dogs dragging their owners behind them at the other end of the alley. "I hope the Mortons are home," Joe said as he and Frank raced for the front porch. He rang the doorbell. The dogs had reached the street and were both heading straight for the porch. Their owners were nowhere in sight. "Chet!" Joe shouted. Just then Chet opened the front door and let Frank and Joe inside. When he saw the dogs, he said, "What did you two do to them?" "Shut the door!" Frank yelled. Now the dogs were on the porch, barking furiously and pawing at the screen door. "We didn't do anything." Chet looked around. "What's that horrible smell?" he asked. He looked at Frank. I guess he wanted a treat too. He looked at Frank and Joe and sniffed. "Hey, it's coming from you too. What's going on here?" Just then the dogs' owners arrived, grabbed the leashes, and began pulling the dogs away from the house. "I guess they can't smell the treats anymore," Joe said. "Wow," Frank said. He looked at Chet. "It's a long story, friend, and we'll tell you about it. But first, we need one of those garbage bags that absorb odors." No one else was at home at the Mortons, so Chet took care of disposing of the liver treats and sprayed the house with room freshener to get rid of the odor. Frank and Joe showered while Chet put their clothes in the dryer with several sheets of scented fabric softener. When Frank and Joe were dressed, they came downstairs where Chet was waiting for them at the kitchen table with sodas. "I smell like roses," Joe complained. "Yeah, I know," Chet told him. "Isn't it great? It's so much better than liver." Frank laughed. Joe wrinkled his nose. "Okay, tell me what's going on," Chet said. "When you two are involved, it's always interesting." "Charlie has disappeared," Frank began, "so we were trying to get him back." He told Chet about Max's reaction when they first told him that Charlie was missing. "We were just sure that Max was using a magic trick to do it." Well, where do the dog treats fit in? Chet asked. Mrs. Breyer said Charlie craves them, Joe explained. He thought if we filled our pockets with treats and went to Max's house, Charlie would go crazy trying to get them, and we'd solve the mystery of his disappearance. Instead, we managed to stink up the O'Malley's house, Frank continued, and Mrs. O'Malley said we could only play with Max if we went home and took baths. It was really embarrassing, Joe said. Well, I see Charlie isn't the only dog who goes nuts over those treats, Chet said. Frank nodded. That's how we ended up here, he said. If Max really did take Charlie, hoping people would think he magically made him disappear, Joe said, then I'm sure now, after what just happened, he's going to make it impossible for us to find him until he's ready to make Charlie magically reappear. Maybe Max really can make animals disappear, Chet said. Max isn't really that good, I don't think, Frank said. In fact, I'm beginning to wonder if maybe someone else is actually behind this, and if maybe Charlie has just been smart enough to escape on his own from wherever he's been being held prisoner. He shook his head. The problem is, how many more times will Charlie be able to do that? We have to find the dog napper before it's too late. We both thought Max was a jerk, Joe said. So that made it easy for us to think he was behind Charlie's disappearance. Frank nodded. But our evidence is only circumstantial, he said. We don't have real evidence. Frank and Joe stood up. We need to go home and make a list of new suspects, Joe said. Frank grinned at Chet. Thanks for saving our lives. Chet grinned back. That's what friends are for. Chapter 8. Suspect number 1 again. Frank and Joe headed to Mrs. Breyer's house. We need to find out who in the neighborhood doesn't like Charlie, Frank said. Then we'll have some other suspects to question. Joe rang Mrs. Breyer's doorbell. Immediately he heard barking inside. Oh, hi, boys, Mrs. Breyer said when she opened the door. Charlie is back home. That's wonderful, Frank said. He wanted to add, but for how long, but he didn't. May we visit with you for a minute? It's about Charlie. Of course, boys, Mrs. Breyer said. She opened the screen door. Come on inside and I'll give you each a glass of lemonade. That sounds wonderful, Joe said. He loved Mrs. Breyer's lemonade. Frank and Joe followed Mrs. Breyer to her sun porch. Have a seat, boys, she said, and I'll be right back. Mrs. Breyer soon returned with a pitcher of her secret recipe lemonade and poured 3 tall, frosty glasses. Charlie lay at her feet. Everyone took a long sip of the lemonade, and then Mrs. Breyer said, Now then, boys, what's on your minds? We believe that someone is taking Charlie from your backyard, Frank began. And then somehow Charlie manages to escape, but we're not sure how much longer your dog will be able to do that, Joe continued. So we're wondering if you know of anyone who doesn't like Charlie. Goodness, boys, I can't imagine anyone not liking Charlie enough to do something like kidnap him, Mrs. Breyer said. She shook her head. I'm afraid I won't be able to help. Charlie is a wonderful dog, Mrs. Breyer, Frank said, but some people, well, they just don't. Wait a minute, she said. My neighbor's grandson. Oh, no, he wouldn't kidnap Charlie just for that. Let us do the investigating, Mrs. Breyer, Joe said. That's our job. And you boys do have a wonderful reputation in Bayport, she said. All right. Well, Mr. Buster and his grandson, Johnny Buster, live across the alley from me. Johnny shows dogs too, but he's never won. Charlie always places ahead of any dog Johnny's showing. Joe wrote down Johnny Buster's name in his notebook. They now had a new who. Anyone else, Mrs. Breyer, he asked. Now that you have me thinking about this, there is a young man named Philip Stanley whom I hired to walk Charlie once a day, Mrs. Breyer said. But he quit after a week when I wouldn't pay him more. I've heard of him, Frank said. Joe wrote down Philip's name under Johnny's. Then he stood up and looked over at Frank. "We'd better talk to both of these suspects as soon as possible," he said. Mrs. Breyer walked Frank and Joe to the front door. "I hope you find out who's doing this, boys," she said. "We'll do our best," Frank told her. "And thanks for the lemonade." Frank and Joe hurried around to the other side of the block and rang Mr. Buster's bell. After several minutes, a teenage boy opened the door and said, "What are you selling?" He had a cast on his leg and was leaning on a crutch. "We're not selling anything," Frank told him. "We're just helping Mrs. Breyer, the lady who lives across the alley from you. Her dog Charlie keeps disappearing, and we're wondering if you've noticed anyone suspicious in the neighborhood this week." "No, I haven't. But ever since my accident, I can't walk around much," Johnny said. He gave Frank and Joe a long, hard look. "Is she blaming me?" "Oh, no," Joe said hurriedly. "We just told her we'd check around the neighborhood, that's all." "Well, I never have liked that dog because he's always beating my dogs," Johnny said. "But I certainly wouldn't want any harm to come to him." "Well, thank you," Frank said. "We're sorry to have disturbed you." Back on the sidewalk, Joe said, "There's no way he could have taken Charlie, so that leaves Philip Stanley." Joe rubbed his chin, just the way their father did when he was thinking. "How do you know this guy, Frank?" "I don't, but his younger brother goes to our school," Frank said. "I overheard him in the hall the other day telling someone Philip works in that new supermarket a couple of streets over." "Off we go," Joe said. When Frank and Joe got to Riverview Market, they found Philip cleaning up the eggs from a carton someone had dropped. "Aren't you Jordan Stanley's older brother?" Frank asked him. "That's right," Philip said. "What can I do for you boys?" Some of these pages don't want to open. "Well, we live across the street from Mrs. Breyer," Joe said, "and we used to see you walking her dog, Charlie." "We haven't seen you doing it lately," Frank continued, "so we were going to ask her if we could have the job to earn some extra money, but we wanted to know why you quit." "Is she hard to work for?" Joe asked. "Oh, no, she's one of the nicest ladies you'll ever meet," Philip said. "That's always been our impression, too," Frank said. "But I'm trying to save money for college, and Mrs. Breyer couldn't pay me more," Philip continued. "So when I turned 16 last week, I quit and took this job." "That makes sense," Joe said. Outside, Frank and Joe stood for a minute. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Frank asked. "If you're thinking we talked ourselves out of believing Max was a suspect just because we were embarrassed at his house," Joe replied, "then yes, I am." "Real detectives don't do that, Joe," Frank said, "and that means we shouldn't either." Joe added, "Max O'Malley is back to being suspect number 1. And next week will be 9 and 10, and those are the last 2 chapters of the book. So I'm glad you were with me today, and I hope to see you next week for the last 2 chapters of this book. Thank you for being with me, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye now.